Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. This is your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we're diving deep into the world of plant medicine, master plant dietas, and integration with a true pioneer in the field. I had the pleasure of speaking with Kat Courtney, a psychedelic integration coach with over 15 years of experience and the co-founder of Plant Medicine People. In our conversation together, Kat shares her transformative journey from struggling with mental health to finding profound healing through ayahuasca. We explore the fascinating relationship between ayahuasca and San Pedro, delve into the practice of master plant dietas, and discuss Kat's approach to psychedelic integration. Our conversation touches on the importance of intention in plant medicine work, essential practices for ayahuasca integration, as well as Kat's unique retreat offering. Here's a little bit more about Kat. Kat is a plant medicine pioneer with 2 decades of professional psychedelic experience. She's the author of Plant Medicine Mystery School, Volume 1, The Superhero Healing Powers of Psychotropic Plants, and is traditionally trained as an ayahuasquera and huachumera. Kat's entire life is devoted to helping humans discover the power of being in relationship with plant spirits. In our conversation together, Kat and I discuss her personal transformation through ayahuasca, the divine feminine and masculine aspects of ayahuasca and huachuma, or San Pedro, master plant dietas, and comparing isolated versus social, group containers for that practice, the importance of intention in plant medicine work, essential practices for ayahuasca integration, and an overview of Kat's themed retreats. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into my conversation with Kat Courtney. Kat, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Paul. It's awesome to be here.
So let's start by, I'm going to kind of read a little bit more of your bio that you have on Plant Medicine People. Before ayahuasca, so ayahuasca has clearly been an important medicine for you. You knew portals of darkness, so paralyzing that you spent years and years dealing with depression, bipolar reactiveness, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. When you met the medicine, you dealt with mind-numbing migraine headaches, severe asthma attacks, and regular bouts of intense panic. And then came the indescribable gift of plant medicine. That is a potent and powerful testimony to what plant medicine offers. So, and I'd love if you could we could start a little bit about who you were prior to plant medicine, and why is it that you had struggled so deeply? What is it that you had to navigate in life prior to coming to plant medicine? And let's start there, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into the sort of transformational impact of ayahuasca in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, BA, before ayahuasca, I had on paper a fantastic life. I was running a video game studio, wow. Beautiful people in my life. But I guess I would just say I'd never been taught to deal with my intense emotions. Just being a deep feeler and a passionate, fiery person that felt out of control. And so I was diagnosed bipolar, functional alcoholic, because alcohol often sort of tapers that intensity enough that I could feel like I was normal. Bulimic, because I lived in LA and always trying to meet that ideal. But I had assumed, because it'd been told to me, that I would have to be medicated, and, that's just who I was. And there was no hope for becoming more grounded and present and capable and strong. So the first time I drank ayahuasca, that's the first thing that came in is, why couldn't I? Why have I been programmed to believe that I'm broken? Because I wasn't broken. It's just the Western world doesn't know how to deal with people like me. And there are so many people like me. So that's where ayahuasca changed everything out of the gate. It's not like, as you know, it's not, I didn't get cured. It's not about that. What I found is the inspiration that, of course, I can heal. Of course, that's available to me. And that changed everything.
And what inspired you in that belief? And maybe even deeper than that, why did you not believe that prior? Like what what was it about maybe your upbringing or whatever it was where you're like, didn't necessarily see that as an initial, because most of us are born the same way, right? It's part of our sort of cultural conditioning, but I'm curious from your lens, from your context, how that experience was.
Yeah, well, just because my upbringing, at least at that point, didn't bring me alternative views outside of Western medicine. I was slightly aware of holistic paths, but had never explored anything other than my psychiatrist's office and my general practitioner. I did yoga here and there, but from this perspective of mental health, I had never been shown an alternative idea of way of looking at it. And so when I went to the jungle the first time and worked with ayahuasca, not only did I have that awakening of, wait a second, of course I could heal, I was introduced to a culture who deals with what we call mental illness in an entirely different way. They called it a mental injury that, oh, look, you're just reacting from trauma. So I think one of the key things is the separation that it wasn't a personality disorder in me necessarily. I'd gone through some stuff and never been taught to deal with that. And I was in this kind of recycling process of trauma and pain. And nobody ever gave me an alternate way to work with that.
Had you been medicated prior to working with ayahuasca? And I only ask because I would imagine there could be some challenges in weaning off certain psychiatric medications, right? There's a lot of psychiatric medications that are contraindicated with ayahuasca. Did you have to navigate that, or were you sort of, clear that psychiatric medication was not the move, so it wasn't as much of a challenge to start to work with ayahuasca?
It was the latter. I had already gone down that path and it didn't work for me. It made me feel like a zombie. I lost touch with my authenticity, and that was worse to me than navigating intense mood swings. So I was already completely free of medication. The only thing I was medicating with was ecstasy, MDMA, and alcohol. And that was working better than the SSRIs had. So I didn't have to prep for Aya in that regard.
And so what was it like to go down to the jungle? I think in 2006 was the year that you went to begin working with ayahuasca. What was it like at that point in time? Where did you go? How did you find the facilitator or the practitioners that you ended up working with? Bring us a little bit into that story.
Yeah, I was really blessed in that I was dating someone who had been there 6 years prior. And so it had this experience with a place that still exists today. It was formed by a Westerner in the 90s who has since transitioned, Howard Lawler, who owned Spirit Quest. Howard was my first teacher, father figure in this space. So I got lucky that I landed in the best of the best, working with the Shipipo, a gentleman who is now in his, I think he might be 80 by now, and has been pouring medicine since he was 12. So legit, safe, beautiful environment. And not knowing that isn't necessarily common. Back then, there wasn't any information really about ayahuasca. So I was really lucky. I landed in the perfect place.
And were you initially jumping right into a master plant dieta, or did that come later on down the line?
That came later. Initially, I just fell in love with ayahuasca, and it was going back again and again and again. Then Howard was a huachumero. So then Howard introduced me to huachuma. And I got to experience the basically what I consider the plant version of MDMA, which I was in love with in the synthetic way. Then after I met huachuma, I did my first master plant diet, maybe, a handful of months after that. So it was a slow progression.
So, Kat, I'm curious if you can dive a little bit into those differences then between ayahuasca and San Pedro, because my sense is you have quite a bit of work navigating both of those medicines. How are they different? What are some of the sort of different aspects and elements of those medicines?
Oh, I love this question, Paul, because they're literally night and day. Literally, right? Because we work with ayahuasca at night and huachuma during the day, or San Pedro during the day. And it's for me, it's the embodiment of the difference between the divine feminine and the divine masculine. But in ways that I think can be very confronting, at least for me, working with ayahuasca, the feminine is familiar. The ferocity, the emotional component, the sort of fluidity. But with huachuma, I feel like I met the divine masculine for the first time through working with him, because it's an empathogen, right? Not a traditional psychedelic in that there's not a lot of visions necessarily with it. It's a very emotional, heart-based experience. And that's not necessarily, at least in the world that we live in, how we would define the divine masculine very often. And yet, that's where I learned what that energy is. The masculine holds the container for the feminine to feel and process. And so the word that I use to describe San Pedro is safe. He taught me it's safe to feel my emotions. It's safe to be in my body. It's safe to exist, to be conscious. And that masculine energy, we call him grandfather, right? It's so powerful in reminding us that everything's okay here, that everything we're experiencing is in fact safe. So where ayahuasca is the fierce feminine that unravels, the recesses of our psyches and shows us what we're trying to hide. Huachuma is the grandfather energy that holds us and helps us to feel and process and be with what unravels in ayahuasca. So I was taught, work with ayahuasca and then come to huachuma. And huachuma actually helps to integrate what can happen in ayahuasca life. So that's the best way I can describe it. They couldn't be more different, and yet they're so complementary.
Well, it's interesting now that you're even talking about this. I posted kind of not a joke necessarily, but a fun take on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, which was it'd be cool to start a clothing line that's called Acid and Ayahuasca. For me, what I'm finding with my medicine work is I've been going deeper into the ayahuasca space for ceremonial, sort of deep healing ceremonial work with this ancient plant medicine. And at the same time, my favorite psychedelic has always been LSD. It was the first psychedelic that I did when I was 19 and had a really profound experience. And there's just something about my psyche and my way of being that really resonates with LSD. And so these days I microdose with LSD and I macrodose with ayahuasca. And LSD, from a neurobiological perspective, is very similar to huachuma, but I would say that the key difference is precisely what you mentioned, which is that huachuma seems to just have a bit more of a heart opening with it. LSD tends to be a bit more cognitive in nature, but they both have a similar impact on dopamine and energy. Mm-hmm. And so I find that whether I'm taking LSD or huachuma, I usually want to go hiking in the mountains for hours at a time,
Yeah, you want to move. You want to use your senses. And same with me, by the way. I was 19 the first time I did LSD, and it was instant love affair of like, oh, this feels normal. Like all this like opening and expansion. And I agree, huachuma is the same, but more in an emotional way. So they're complementary and beautiful, in that way. They work similar but differently. So I love that. Not very many people have brought that up and understand that there's profound similarities in those medicines.
It's a very cool distinction. And LSD gets a bad rap, unfortunately, because it's a semi-synthetic. Even in the psychedelic community, I would say, or even in, I would argue, the plant medicine community, it's a semi-synthetic. But I've always found at these lower doses, I'll do a high dose every few years, but not as often anymore. But at these lower doses, I just get this sort of like zippy zap vibe from LSD microdoses that create this sort of sense of flow through everything, which leads me to my next question. There's a lot of retreats out there these days. You have a phenomenal retreat with plant medicine people. How do you look at that relationship between huachuma and ayahuasca within the same retreat container? Do you facilitate that way? Is it advisable? Is it better to keep separate containers for those two medicines? How do you look at sort of that relationship?
It's a great question. Everybody's got different opinions out there in the space. Okay. So my experience, the training that I had from Howard, is that they're incredibly complementary in the same container. But there's an order to it. Ayahuasca comes first. Let's take the top off. Let's bring things to the surface in the depths of our psyche. You use the word deep to describe, that's ayahuasca doesn't know shallow. She's going to go to the depths. Beautiful. Bring that to the surface and then, have a day to start to integrate and then bring in huachuma. As not only, his own experience in terms of a conscious exploration, but also to help begin to integrate, because huachuma is very in the body. ayahuasca is very cosmic. So he helps to bring it back in. And I like to use embodiment as an alternate word to integration. Because if we're not experiencing things through our vessel, our homes, then we're still too cognitive and mental with it, where huachuma brings that in beautifully. So I find the two in the same retreat container to not only be complementary, but be incredibly helpful, because then after you've been able to embody some of what ayahuasca brought forth, you can go into the world in a more graceful way. It's tough when you do a few rounds with ayahuasca and then hop on a plane and come back into this crazy world. That can be really jarring, that contrast. I find huachuma helps to bridge that gap a bit and make that a bit more graceful. And so I'm just a big fan of incorporating him in I don't always do it with the retreats that we do, but I prefer it. I always do huachuma after working deeply with ayahuasca for myself to help integrate. So I love to provide that for other people too.
I've never been able to have that experience, and hopefully at some point, to have that. I've worked quite a bit with ayahuasca, and I've participated in 2 ceremonies with huachuma, both in the Miami area, but never have done. I mean, interestingly enough, never have done either ayahuasca or huachuma in Peru, in their homeland, and so I feel sort of a calling to go explore that, just because the lineage of doing it in the place where it comes from carries, I would imagine, even more significance and impact. And I'm curious, from your perspective, microdosing has been obviously very much talked about topic and approach over the last several years. It's something that I've focused a lot on, specifically with LSD and psilocybin. What is your take on microdosing ayahuasca and microdosing San Pedro? Is this something that is common? Is this something that you coach individuals on as part of the integration process? Is there a role for microdosing these plant medicines, or is it better just to really focus on those transformative high dose approaches with huachuma and ayahuasca?
Good question. So I'll address ayahuasca first. Regarding the brew, I don't advise microdosing that unless you're a carrier of that medicine. It is like your mission to develop the most intimate relationship, because it's just dicey for all kinds of reasons. It's hard to dose properly. Every brew is different in terms of intensity. Our sensitivity matters so much, and that differs day to day. So it's a really hard medicine to microdose for a lot of reasons. Now, if you just work with the ayahuasca vine, however, and which is not psychotropic, but is the MAOI component and can help with the anxiety and all the things that a lot of us are called to ayahuasca for, I think that can be quite beautiful. But it still needs to be, it's still ayahuasca. It's still her very powerful spirit that demands that we give her respect and that work with her reverently, not as a supplement that we pop sort of unconsciously. So, yes, I do work with people that want to cultivate that relationship, and you work with that medicine in subtle ways. Huachuma, on the other hand, I think is fantastic for microdosing. For those of us that feel like we're too stuck in our heads, working with a little huachuma, like the same sort of protocol that you would with psilocybin every 3rd day, something like that, to cultivate more conscious connection to our heart energy. Fantastic. And obviously much easier to source too than ayahuasca, right? It's more, San Pedro cactus isn't endangered either, at least not yet. So for lots of reasons, that's an accessible medicine. And I think it's like the unsung hero right now in the microdosing space that has tons of potential, because our culture is too stuck in our heads. And that medicine can help bridge that gap between heart and head. And so he's wonderful in that context.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. We have a microdosing experience. It's a 6-week group coaching container, and we emphasize mostly LSD and psilocybin. But I was sharing with a group the other day, huachuma, interestingly enough, has the most impact on inflammation in the gut. And it's what a lot of folks don't realize is that a lot of the benefits of microdosing come from this reharmonizing approach, or this reharmonizing impact on the overall psyche and system. And partly it's because even with psilocybin and LSD, it's still helping with reducing that chronic inflammation. It's an anti-inflammatory. But huachuma is about twice as powerful in that way. And so unfortunately, it's just, at least in my world, I know I can go to Home Depot and, buy San Pedro there. We have a sourcing guide even on Third Wave that talks about how might you source San Pedro and huachuma, but it takes a lot of processing. You have to take quite a bit more of it. And unfortunately, there's like these days, it's hard to throw a rock and not hit like a microdosing supplier in LA or SF or New York. It's all over the place. Huachuma still is a little bit, it's just not as available for a lot of these underground sellers. And so I've always been keen on like, that'd be like an interesting way to just further amplify microdosing, would be to focus on education with San Pedro specifically, because it grows incredibly quick. It's not endangered. It has a lot of those same cognitive benefits as LSD has, but like you said, it's more embodied overall. Now, have you combined the MAOI of the vine of ayahuasca with the microdose of huachuma? Do you have any experience with that, or
a little bit, because I have in the context of the master plant diet. So I will have people that diet huachuma and come into ceremony with Aya. But on ceremony days, we will just pull back and go really gentle with the dosage with huachuma, and only in the morning, right? We're not combining the two together, but it's beautiful, but not on a regular protocol for months at a time, working with huachuma and then working with Aya, just in shortened diets.
Yeah, I'd be curious, because as you were talking about that, and these two things together, and as we know, MAOIs amplify phenethylamines or tryptamines, lysergamides. And so I would just be curious to see what impact that might have, what experience people would have if they were to combine the MAOI and huachuma either on the same day or even on alternating days,
Yeah, and that's what we do with the diets. And I'm telling you, like, it's often the people that come that are dealing with deep depression, that are in that heavy stagnation. And I will suggest this is a diet, and incredible results of people that just feel kind of like they're coming out of their shell because of the amplification that you're speaking to. Is that they play off each other in that way.
They do.
Yeah.
All right, let's dive into master plant dietas. You mentioned it a couple times already. I feel like this is one of your core points of expertise or places of expertise when it relates to plant medicine. I was sharing with you that prior to our conversation, I was sharing with you that I had gone to Costa Rica to a center called Brave Earth, which is where we host our intensives for our practitioner training program. And outside of obviously that container of our practitioner retreats, I just did another retreat there, which was an ayahuasca dieta, a master plant dieta with 3 Shipibo women, Yanez and her 2 daughters, who came to Brave Earth to facilitate that. And it was a 10-day container. It was 9 days of silence, no talking with other people. You're in your own room most of the time. 1 meal a day is what I ate usually. It was a lunch, no sugar, no salt, no spices, very plain lentils, plantains, sometimes a little fish, cauliflower, just very plain basic things, but healthy, nourishing. And then 5 ceremonies over those 10 days. And as part of that dieta, I dieted guayusa, which is a reasonably well-known herb or substance. It's actually in quite a few energy drinks in the West. But as a master plant diet, I found it to be very sort of buoyant, loving, energetic, and sweet, like kind and soft. Like it felt really good. And this is a very shamanic practice. And my intention going into that was, I've had a tumultuous relationship with cannabis that I've talked about on the podcast prior. It's been quite sticky in my life. And so the intention was to give myself a really clean break from cannabis. And so as part of the dieta, there's no cannabis for a month before. There's no cannabis for at least a month after. And I was able to extend that to about 8 months in total. And so I had this really long break from cannabis as a result of that dieta. And what I found is that it's helpful not to smoke a lot of cannabis all the time, but that also every now and then it's not overly detrimental to sort of my cognition and overall sort of capacity. So I just wanted to open that as sort of a primer about my own experience. One of the most powerful and impactful things that I've had the opportunity to participate in. And so I want to turn it over to you now, just for our listeners and our audience, if you could sort of give an overarching view of what is a master plant dieta. Maybe talk a little bit about one that's in person versus one that could be done, let's say virtually, or not all being in the same place, because I know that there's the capacity to do both. And then maybe talk a little bit about these different master plants. Which ones do you know the best? What can be dieted as part of that? I've heard tobacco can be dieted. Huachuma, you mentioned, can be dieted. Rose can be dieted. Bobensana is one of the most common ones. I talked about guayusa, right? So there's a lot of different plants that we can diet. And I'd be curious to hear, what are some of your favorite plants to diet as part of this container?
It's my favorite topic in a way, Paul, because master plant diets are accessible to everybody, whereas the entheogens aren't necessarily. So the way that I describe a diet is it's essentially a marriage between the human spirit and the plant spirit, a temporary one, but aren't they all? Because they will either end in life or death, right? So, but this is an agreement to merge with the spirit of that plant. Whereas, if you have a cup of tea with guayusa or rose at the end of the day, I call that dating the plant. You're forming a relationship, but the diet is all in because of all of the restrictions that you named and just this commitment that you're looking at the plant as your primary relationship, your master teacher for the period of the time that you're dieting. Now, as you mentioned, there's a couple of different ways to do this. The old school way is what we call an isolated master plant dieta, which is what you described. You're in isolation. Your only job is to connect with the plant, to be in meditation, to be present, and also to drink ayahuasca, which is interesting when you work with ayahuasca in these plants. She's really good at passing the baton and making it about the relationship with the plant that you're dieting, which those of us that know ayahuasca, she's not really a background player, but yet she's incredible with how she deepens that connection to the plant that we're dieting. It's not required to drink ayahuasca when you do a diet, but it's amazing and amplifies, the amplification is true in this regard as well. So that's the old school way. And I'm Shipipo trained, and that's how I dieted for a long time. Then there's what we call dieta suave, which is soft diet, which really isn't appropriately named because it's a social experience where you're still handling your job and your relationships and your life, but you're eating in a really restrictive way. You're celibate. You're holding your sexual energy in. You're not taking cannabis and things like that. The social diets, I think, are harder because they require us to be very committed and disciplined. And also the plants that we're working with then can work real time in the context of our life. You go to the office and you get triggered, boom, and the plant's right there. Like, oh, look at this wound that you're responding to. And it's just like this expanded awareness of how we walk in the world. So I love both for different reasons. Isolation, wow, your only job is to be with that plant. A lot can happen. In a social setting, seeing the way you react in your normal everyday life in a different way is really powerful. I actually do the retreats that we do with the diets is a bit of a hybrid. We have a couple of days of silence, but there's a lot of then interaction because it's a bit of the social elements and a bit of the isolated elements, because I love the social elements of seeing real time in a different way how I'm walking in the world. So we do a bit of a hybrid of that. And it's also a little bit more accessible to Westerners that are like, whoa, 9 days of silence and all I'm eating is cauliflower. And it's hardcore. And I love that, but it's not the only way to do this process. Some of the plants, as this process has expanded out of the jungle, we've started to recognize that there are master plants on every continent. I say there's thousands. Other people say there's a dozen or more. It depends on your definition of master plant. I think all plants have something to teach. They don't all want to do that, though. Not every plant is like, oh, I want to work with human consciousness, because, I think it's amazing so many do, because we're not easy. But so you can obviously diet plants like huachuma, ayahuasca, both the vine and the brew, that are psychotropic. But then you can also diet rose and sage and all of these plants that maybe we are aware of in terms of how they work in shamanic settings or even medicinally as an herb. but as spirits that want to teach us, they're incredible. So Rose, perfect example. Rose is the medicine of love. We know that. We give roses when we express love to people. So she is heart medicine, but she also has thorns. She teaches also self-protection, because if you reach for a rose and you're unconscious about it, she'll cut you without apology. And so she teaches us that same thing of, why would you let somebody who wants to cause you harm unconsciously or consciously into your field? Have boundaries. So like, it's powerful medicine. And when you merge with her in diet, it's just incredible how strong and clear these messages are from a plant that isn't psychedelic. So people that diet plants like rose, they come in going, yeah, but is anything really going to happen? And then when it does, it's kind of mind-blowing, because you expect that from ayahuasca, you might not from rose, and yet she can deliver, and it's wild and amazing. So all the plants that we know that are very common in herbalism, as an example, can be dieted. But in the jungle, you mentioned bobenzana. She's often one of the first diets that they recommend, because bobenzana is the queen of self-love. She shows us where we're, still criticizing or judging or not loving ourselves, which, if you don't have a foundation of self-love, what do you have? You don't have a foundation, right? So bobenzana is becoming really well known because we need her medicine deeply. And a lot of times you can tell how the plant's going to work with us on diet by how they grow. So bobenzana is a perfect example of that. She grows along the river. She gets decimated when the rains come because she's not that tall. But as soon as the sun comes out, within a day or two, she's popped out again of like, I'm back. So what does she teach? Resilience. The power to weather the storm is the core of her medicine, and the foundation of that coming from self-love and trusting ourselves. So that these plants have so much to offer us. Whether or not we're working with ayahuasca or entheogens, it kind of, in a way, doesn't matter, because they're going to help us if we're committed to being disciplined. But there's just different ways in which we can connect with them. So the jungle has, several dozen master plants that are common, but the whole world has hundreds, if not thousands of them, which is exciting.
And what about tobacco?
One of the biggest and hardest ones. So tobacco is one of those plants that we will only work with in isolation. We don't do social diets because it is physically challenging. So plants like tobacco that can kick our butts physically in a beautiful way are reserved for in-person, really deep dives. And tobacco, it just turns you inside out in terms of the cleanse and purification, as well of course, teaching protection, divine masculine strength and empowerment. It's one of the toughest diets by far because of how physically challenging it can be.
And we interviewed Jeremy Narby about 2.5 years ago for the podcast. He had recently, at that point in time, published a book about this relationship between ayahuasca and tobacco. And even similar to the parallel that you drew, as ayahuasca as the divine feminine and huachuma as the divine masculine, there's a similar yin-yang relationship between ayahuasca and tobacco. Tobacco is known as the great protector. That's why mapacho is so commonly smoked. And when we're just so the audience is aware, when we're talking about diets, we're not talking about like you pick off a rose petal and you eat it, or you take a bunch of sage and you try to like knock it back. You're making tea, most commonly out of these different plants that you then drink on a consistent, you drink for a week straight or 10 days straight, or maybe a month straight in a very sort of intentional way. Where for us, when I was dieting with Bayusa, I would sing to it every morning because plants love music and song, and maybe a little bit of a prayer that was said with the master plant. So having that deep intentional relationship, understanding that you're bringing a unique form of consciousness into this sort of symbiotic relationship with you is really central to that process and how it unfolds.
Yeah, exactly. Beautifully described. Because as I think we all learn in any avenue in the shamanic realm, it's all about intention. Right. But even ayahuasca is amplified by the strength of our intention, and we can block her. Even ayahuasca, who's so powerful. So the master plant diets, that's one of the core things I think they teach, is how powerful we are when we are focused and intentional and coming from the heart and really showing up. like what can happen when we do that. And we sing and we offer, reverence and commitment to giving back than what nature as a whole can give to us. Like, I know every time I do a diet, I crack that code more and more of like, yeah, I'm showing up. I'm co-creating. It's not just the plant doing something. It's me learning how to dance and co-create with consciousness through this particular plant. It's amazing.
It is amazing. So the next question that I have for you is, you mentioned the sort of old school way, which is deep isolation with a dieta. It can go from 10 days to 14 days to a month to 3 months to 6 months to a year, right? There are some people who spend a year in isolation with diet versus the more social diet, which tends to be, from what I understand, more elongated. As you said, you're still navigating everyday reality. Let's say someone's listening to this and they're like, oh, this sounds like something I might be interested in doing. How kind of provide a little bit of a sense of how do we choose between those two based on our context, based on what's going on in our life, based on our intention? Is there a situation or context in which a social diet might be more appropriate versus sort of a deep isolation diet in the jungle?
Yeah, for me, there isn't an order to things in that you don't have to start with one or the other. I think it's really about the flow of our lives. If you have the opportunity to unplug and go into the wilderness and go all in an isolated diet, amazing. I would say seize the day, because in our busy lives, we don't often have that. So people often start with social diets simply because it's just hard to have the resources and the time to unplug. And that's okay. And you're right that an isolated diet, 7 to 10, 14 days, that's normal. Whereas a social diet, 14 days is the minimum that I will do with people, at least, because it just takes longer for the connection to be made consciously for us. Because at the bare minimum in a social diet, what you want to do is start and end your day with that cup of tea, connecting to the plant. And then your busy day can happen in between. That some people can do more than that, but that's the bare minimum. So it's going to take longer. I was on a year-long master plant diet with sage early on in my apprenticeship. My teacher was like, you're going to give me a year because you need it. And that was wild to have that level of discipline and focus, but it changed my life completely. It's the foundation.
In isolation? This was in isolation?
This was actually socially. I did some isolation during that, some retreats and whatnot, but most of it was out in the world, which was harder because I had all the temptations always, there. So yeah, you can, but typically with a social diet, a month is the sweet spot. I'll do 2 weeks, but a month is like, especially people new to it, because that's plenty of time to get the hang of the process, to start feeling like you're connecting and communicating, and for energy to move, for things to come into your awareness. But 2 weeks, we could still work with that. Yeah. And then, by the way, the question people ask mostly is, how do you decide which plant, right?
Right.
And we decide which plant based upon, well, at least I do, based upon what the intentions are. So someone comes to me and says, I'm lacking self-love. I'm feeling scattered. I'm depressed, like whatever it is that they want to heal or to learn about. There's always a plant for that, and many plants. So I like to offer a few options and say, well, these 3 plants align with your intention. Who do you want to marry? Because I joke that arranged marriages don't really typically work, do they?
Right.
So it needs to be a resonant connection, that somebody gets excited about rose instead of it saying you have to diet rose. Like, oh, I don't want to diet rose, because that ruins our intention, that power of that connection. So that's how I do it. Sometimes people know that this plant is in my field. I have to work with huachuma. Okay, cool. Yeah. But typically these are the intentions, and then I can align a few plants that I think will honor that.
Beautiful. Thank you. In the interest of time, I want to keep moving, because part of what you have done over the last 15 years is you've spent a lot of time as a psychedelic integration coach as well. And not only supporting people in ceremony and facilitating that, but also in the weeks and months to follow. And we talk a lot about integration on the podcast. And we've had a little bit of conversation about integration specific to ayahuasca, but I'd love to hear your perspective on this. How is integration different when working with ayahuasca as a plant? What are some some ways or how do we approach that differently compared to maybe something like psilocybin or ketamine or MDMA or even LSD? What does ayahuasca call for that is very unique to that plant medicine in and of itself?
Great question. Because of the intensity that ayahuasca, I mean, it's not guaranteed, but she's more probable to go through something that feels very discombobulating. Integration for ayahuasca is, for me, essential. Whereas, huachuma, it might be more a nice to have, not a requirement. Ayahuasca, it's like there's so many of us that even if we have awesome experiences and then we come back into the world, it can spawn an existential crisis. The only other thing I would say it's essential for an integration is 5-MeO, is these experiences that can literally turn our world upside down. And hey, look, rebirth is awesome. Death and rebirth is awesome, but it's hard to come back into the world when you have something truly transformative occur without a process of how to integrate that. Because even the best experiences on ayahuasca, if we come back into the world and we don't integrate them, they're just kind of distant memories, which is like, well, you're not capitalizing on that experience to help change our everyday lives, which is the point of working with these plants, is that our lives improve as a result of it. But with Aya, because A, she's a shadow worker extraordinaire, and she goes into the depths of our psyches and exposes things, and B, because it's intense and difficult and messy and beautiful, I think it's essential to make integration a priority, because at best, we can not integrate something special, and at worst, we're worse off, at least in how we feel, because we're not making integration a priority.
So what do you prioritize as part of the integration process for ayahuasca? If you're working with a client or a group, let's say, what are maybe, especially in the week or two after that ayahuasca experience, what are you emphasizing as key aspects of integration in the week or 2 weeks after ayahuasca?
Yeah, first and foremost, a commitment to a daily spiritual practice. However it is that we define that. It could be get on the yoga mat, go for a walk in nature. I begin every day sitting at my altar, asking myself one core question. How do you feel today, kiddo? What's going on? So the core of it has to be a commitment to being present to what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, because it's so easy just to come back and get distracted by life and get sucked into that vortex of the never-ending to-do list and not stop and check in and say, how am I doing? What is different? What is new? What do I need? What do I need to feel? So it sounds so simple. It's like ayahuasca calls this the balance of doing and being. So we call it the doobie dance.
Nice.
And most of us are do, and maybe a speck of being here and there. So it's some commitment to beginning and or ending the day by just going, what's going on with me? What am I feeling? And yes, you can journal or you can speak it to a recorder or whatever it is, but just the simple act of asking yourself, how am I feeling? What am I processing? What am I confused about? All of those things, being self-inquiry, being curious. That's the foundation of it. And then for each individual, I can help them create a protocol that's appropriate for what they're working with, but it has to have that foundation of self-inquiry and like showing up for ourselves every day.
And what I also tend to emphasize, and this is especially true with ayahuasca for all the reasons that you mentioned, because there's a lot that is brought up. There's a lot of insights or downloads that often come through. There could be a desire to change a lot of things in our lives when we come back from those experiences. And so that emphasis on just the check-in is really key in the week, 2 weeks afterwards, because it's really asking us to slow down, to be with whatever it is, to not necessarily shift right back into that, well, I got to do this and I got to do this and I got to do this mode, right? Give it a couple weeks, give it maybe a month, right? Before a lot of major changes are made. And then what I do my best to emphasize, and this is true for the coaches that we work with, the practitioners, the individual clients, is focus on one thing, right? That there can be this tendency to go, I'm going to change all these aspects. And what usually happens is none of it works because it's overwhelming and it's too much to actually hold and move all that energy. So just really clarify what's what's the one thing that if you change that one thing, it'll be a completely new foundation for this new sense of self that wants to emerge?
Absolutely. And what you said around slowing down. I actually just today had a session with a long-term client, and she said, it feels like every time we work with the plants, isn't that one of the core messages? Slow down. And one of the things I've learned from ayahuasca is that urgency is a trauma response. Most of us are urgent, not because it really is urgent, but because we have this urgency, and that's trauma. So to slow it down and to be, like you said, really intentional of, okay, the way I usually phrase that is, if the universe were a genie standing in front of you right now, what's the next thing you would say is the priority that you would wish for? Okay, well, then let's focus on that next thing instead of all the things. And then we can't spin all those plates at once. And then we feel like a failure because they all come crashing down. Like, no, we don't need to do it that way. There's always a priority, and being intentional again, being very focused and committed to one thing at a time. And then that will bring us to the next thing and the next thing. Because unless we're in actual danger, there's no need for urgency. No need to feel like we have to do all the things. We have to break up with the boyfriend and change the job and move. And like, I did that, by the way, in my first cycle of ayahuasca. I broke up with the boyfriend in the jungle and was like, I have to break up with you. I have to quit my job. And I had my own video game studio, but I have to do it all. And I don't advise that. That's not the way. It's no regrets because it got me where I'm at, but that was not the smart, intentional way. But nobody taught me that. I didn't know that yet.
Right. Yeah. It's always a balance of change and disruption with stability and not shaking things too much, like, and that's where great coaching, great facilitation, like you said, this is almost 20 years ago now that you were doing this work. There wasn't much perspective and advice out at that point in time. But now with even this podcast that we're doing, like, there is more of a sense of slow down, be in that process of inquiry, step out of the conditioning of you have to know the answer, and just be a little bit more attentive and attuned to what wants to come through, rather than feeling like you got to force an issue or force a thing.
More of that beingness. More of beingness. We don't have to force these things. If we're with them, they're right there. They're present. They want to come forth organically. We don't have to force ourselves to grow, right? A plant doesn't force that. It allows it. And that's part of what the plants are teaching us.
Exactly. Okay. Final question, just as we sort of get near the closing time. Just tell us a little bit about the retreats, the different structures of the retreats that you run. How many people participate in the retreats, the location of the retreats. Just give us a little bit of the lay of the land of, from a professional perspective, in the retreats that you're facilitating. What are the different structures and containers that you've created to work with plant medicine?
Oh, thank you for asking. Well, I have to preface that by saying I'm a Gemini, which means I love variety and diversity. Okay. So we do different themes with the retreats, but we do, I guess I would say, 3 core types of retreats. 1, ayahuasca. 2, ayahuasca and huachuma, sometimes huachuma by himself, but usually the 2 together. And 3, master plant diets, that incorporate probably all of those things, at least ayahuasca. But they always have a theme. Like we just did one last week in Peru. The theme was creativity, connecting with the muse. And we did, art workshops and different things to connect with our creative expression, along with working with ayahuasca, the medicine. We've got one coming up later this year that is a mystery school initiation. I love the old school mystery schools of like using the sacraments, which is what they did, to reconnect with the truth of who we are as consciousness. So doing with Blue Lotus and with ayahuasca, like merging 2 different parts of the world, same kind of ideas in terms of the initiations to help us break free of fear of death, things like that. So the retreats, the medicines I carry are ayahuasca and huachuma and the diet. So that's consistent. But then the different themes and whatnot that we incorporate that become like the meta experience, even though everyone has individual intentions too, that of course the medicines are going to honor. But we have a lot of fun in just playing with the mysteries, basically, and using the sacraments as the experiential portal into remembering all of these awesome things about who we are.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And if folks want to learn more about that, plant medicine people, we have a lot of context in our directory, thethirdwave.co/directory. And remind me of the domain, the URL for the plant medicine people.
It's plantmedicinepeople.com. Easy peasy.
Perfect. Okay. I just like to double check that. And your personal website is katcourtney.com?
It's afterlife.coach, actually. Kat Courtney was taken, damn it. Yeah. So my nickname in the space is the Afterlife Coach. Yeah. So that's, yeah.
Afterlife.coach. If you'd like to potentially work one-on-one with Kat, plantmedicinepeople.com. If you want to explore those retreat options that we talked about today. And you're also on social. So if folks, and what's the social handle, just so we have a sense of that?
Plant medicine people across the board. In IG, we're most active. YouTube. Yeah.
Okay.
Content out there.
Yeah. And if folks want to learn more about dietas, if you have more questions about this relationship between ayahuasca and huachuma in particular, I think Kat is a phenomenal resource for that. And I know we had some technical issues at the opening of the interview. I'm glad we moved to Zoom to do this. It all ended up working out fine. And I appreciate the integrity that you've brought to this work. I mean, you have been doing this work for a very long time. And I think particularly, again, this combo of ayahuasca and huachuma, looking at that divine masculine and divine feminine, these two ancient plants, being masterful at weaving those together is, it's quite a feat. And so, I just appreciate you sharing a little bit of your wisdom and knowledge with us on the podcast today, Kat.
Paul, it's an honor to connect with you. And thank you for all you do. And thank you for just giving me this opportunity to talk with you. This was great.
Absolutely. This was fun. Thank you so much.
Hey listeners, Paul here. I hope you enjoyed our episode today with Kat. A quick reminder to head to the link in the description of this episode to see the full show notes and any of the links that we mention in this episode. We'd love to know what you thought of the conversation. And you can let us know in Third Wave's community, our free platform where you'll find support, discussions, as well as educational resources and providers across our global ecosystem. Sign up for free at community.thethirdwave.co. Make sure to follow the Psychedelic Podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And if you found this episode inspiring or helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for watching. For a deeper dive into the power of microdosing with complementary practice and extra guidance, check out our best-selling microdosing course. It's a science-based protocol with dozens of best practices so you can customize your protocol to your unique needs and goals. Check out the link in the description below.